wanting my kids to be okay, wanting to know they can support themselves. And when I see a pathway that I'm like, oh, this makes so much sense for you, and I mention it, and then there isn't the enthusiasm, and I know they don't know all that I know. The
Yes.
temptation to like force feed that wisdom and be like, no, you have to do this. And let me tell you why. And right, learn from my mistakes. And you cannot shove that down someone's throat.
Yeah, that is a process that will unfold, when they're ready for it, not when we're ready for it. Hi, welcome back to Insights from the Couch. I'm Laura here with my host, Colette. And today we are talking about something that is probably on most of your minds or has crossed your mind at some point, and that is overparenting. Are you an overparenter? Do you know people who do this? And we're just going to talk about all the ways this shows up in the lives of parents and their kids. It's been a problem for people for sure.
And why it's important to recognize if this is a factor, because as therapists, we see this deeply affect the mental health of our female clients at midlife. Increases in anxiety and depression as children and being overly enmeshed with children are at the centerpiece of many women's lives. And not only that, but if you have kids, whether they're young, if you have kids, of course, and that's probably why you're listening to this episode. If they're younger or, if they're in high school or going off to college, this can have, if you're overparenting in any way, even unintentionally, I don't think most of us set out to do this, it can really have a detrimental effect on your children's emotional and physical development, even. So I think it's really important to address. We want to kind of identify it and let's flesh it out a little and then talk about what you can do to pull back so that you're still a supportive, engaged parent, of course. You want to be there for your kids, but you're not stepping over the line into that harmful overparenting category.
And like we were talking about a second ago, is I do not think all overparenting is quite the same. I
Yeah.
think there's different functions and it comes from different places with the parent and the child. I think it's understandable if you have a child that has special needs or a child that has struggles with anxiety or things like that, that can bring out a sense of protectiveness and fear in the parent that can become, I think that parents are always like the first to underestimate their kids, which sounds strange. But I mean, I think about this in terms of driving. Like, if I were to take my son driving, who's 16, I'd be like, "Oh my God, like we have to just like I couldn't even get out of the driveway because I'd be so afraid that they wouldn't be able to handle it." Whereas like somebody else would come in and just like pull them onto the main road. So I think we are always the first to underestimate the functioning of our kids because we're afraid they can't handle things. And if they can't handle it, we can't handle it. So I think there is like if you have a kid with those kinds of special needs, that can really get a cycle going of like, "Oh my God, I gotta protect this kid." But I think there's so many permutations.
Yeah, and if you have a kid with special needs, let's say, whatever that may be,
Yeah,
whether
I'm
it's a
saying that
disability.
broadly.
Yeah, yeah. Then, obviously this is going to look different. What is over parenting or what is an appropriate level of parenting for one child is going to be very different. But I think you make an excellent point because I think most of this is fear-based. And the dilemma, as I see it, in a way, is that in modern times, we have an increasingly dysfunctional and unsafe world. It is not the way it used to be. Yes, there have always been problems. Every generation says this to some degree, but the rates of suicidality among teenagers have skyrocketed.
Yep.
I mean, they've gone up more than 30% just even in the last handful of years. That is astounding. The proliferation of social media and access to what we know can be contagious with some of this suicidal ideation, just even planting ideas in already vulnerable youth mind, not to mention how vulnerable kids are to social comparison, how vulnerable we all are. So, as there are these bigger mental health issues, and then there's more and more crime, it's easier and easier. I mean, I could rattle off a million things, right? From
School
fentanyl,
shootings.
school shootings,
There's all sorts of reasons to be freaked out
to
for
be
your
afraid,
kids.
right?
Yeah.
Even if, right. So I think the conundrum is we have a real reason to be afraid. And then at the same time, and parents used to be so checked out. Really, that used to be the norm, right? We raised ourselves in ways at our age, our generation. But that fear can drive you into being so overly involved that your child doesn't learn to do anything for themselves and then they can't function.
I think that's an extreme example, like the very highly fear-based parent who's out there, and they're probably very would describe themselves as highly type A and conscientious and fearful. But I think there's other permutations of this, which is like where you feel like you need to fix things for your kids,
Hmm.
where you feel like your kids are an extension of you. And this
Yes.
is where, like, unhealed parts of ourselves creep into our children's storylines, and when something bad happens to them, it feels like it's happening for us, and we're intolerant of that process, and
Yep.
so we fly into not letting it be a teachable moment for the whole family. Instead, it's
Yeah.
like, "We've gotta make sure this doesn't happen." And I've seen that in cases, and I've seen, like, a whole family where the mother really fixed soccer teams and college entry for her daughters, and they feel very undermined as adults, like, that they didn't learn what they
Absolutely.
needed to learn.
So
Yeah.
that permutation, I agree with you. I mean, I'm thinking of a client whose daughter was in college and she was contacting professors
Oh,
for her daughter,
absolutely. Yeah,
which
sure.
is pretty over the top, in my opinion. Your child's an adult at that point. So, not even just high school, but when you talk about these permutations, and you're right, there is this enmeshment, right? When you don't really have a separate self from your child, many people living vicariously through their children and seeing their children as an extension of their own ego rather than a distinct individual. But even some of that fixing and some of that, I think maybe some people are driven more by one motive than the other. But I think a lot of people, the fear is wrapped up in the ego and is wrapped up in increasingly parents, our culture now, parents are fixated on their children.
This is like a social event too, because I think your social group and
Yeah.
context really drives this. If you're in a group of women where it's like, okay, there's like 6 acceptable schools for your kids to get into. I mean, the
Yeah.
stakes just got a lot higher
Yep.
for like how safe it feels for your kid to like step out of the norm.
Yeah.
So I think your social milieu really has a lot to do with like how intensely you feel this.
Right.
And how much it drives your behavior with your kids, because if you don't
Agree.
feel it, you can allow things to happen and you can roll with it in a
Right.
different way than if
So
it feels
let's
existential.
I agree. And this the social and the social status. I mean, there are so many pieces that drive this, but I think it's become a collective norm for parents to be overly invested and preoccupied. And that's a piece of it too now. The kind of parenting that went on in the 70s and 80s, people would think is negligent,
Yep, yep, watch
you know?
TV,
Right.
McDonald's in front of the TV.
And run around and do God knows what until
Yes, and just
dinner.
come back when, like, it's dark, before it's
Yeah.
dark, yeah.
And I mean, did anyone ask you about your mental health when you were in high
No,
school?
no.
Right. Me neither. So, let's talk about what a couple of markers real fast are for overparenting, just so people, for our listeners, like you can identify if so, because again, we're not saying don't be involved and don't support,
No, and
but
don't have standards. I mean, I think that that's
right.
not what we're saying. It's just
No.
that this can get out of hand quickly,
Yeah.
and it's not a benefit to anybody.
Right, and have lasting consequences. Okay, so let's talk about what are some of the things. I mean, the first one that stands out to me is this idea of lawnmower parenting. We've graduated from helicoptering to lawn mowing, where you plow through any obstacle that could be in your child's way so that they don't have to experience any discomfort. And as a result, they don't learn any problem solving skills.
So what does this look like? Like bringing the paper they forgot to the school,
Which I've done that.
contacting the school that they didn't get accepted to reconsider them, just making it possible for them to get onto teams they didn't make.
Well, look at
Um,
Lori Laughlin,
yeah, oh,
right?
that's
Right.
staging like your kid in the rowing team.
Right. I mean, that's an extreme, but she's still not really sorry. She is really still not sorry. I
I
mean,
haven't
I don't
seen
know.
her lately. Like what?
I'm talking like I chatted with Lori
Yeah.
yesterday, and I know the inner
She's like, I
workings of
did
her
what
mind.
I had to do. Leave me
Right. But
alone.
my inference, my analysis from listening to her and reading articles, because certain stories like that I get really into and I just follow along. And in fact, she
Yeah.
just recently made a couple of appearances on Larry David's last season of Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Okay.
And she did earn my respect a little just because she made fun of herself and her entitlement, which I thought was at least, like being in on the joke
Yeah.
and recognizing the
I think she
inappropriate.
has to. I mean, I think that's required.
Yeah, but her take kind of seemed to be like, what I did wasn't that bad. I didn't do anything that most parents don't do, depending on their level of resources. And I was just trying to help my kid. But helping your kid, whether you're a multi gazillionaire Hollywood celebrity or a plebe, is letting your kids figure out how to navigate adult life.
Hmm.
Because I was reading that 60% of kids who are transitioning from college report that they do, a recent survey found, report that they do not have the life skills. They feel that they do not have the life skills to navigate being an adult. And 50% of kids going from high school to college reported that they wish their parents had prepared them better for real life.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing some of the cases that I've gotten with young women that like are afraid to order in a restaurant.
Yes.
Like afraid to like
Yes.
order at a drive-through window. They don't want to talk to anybody. They want
Y-
don't want to have to ask for a job
Yes.
application.
Yes.
Like one of
They
the best
cannot.
things you can do is like get your kid to go work over a summer and like have to deal with people.
Amen. I was
Yes.
thinking of that. I know of somebody who's, 20-year-old or so did not want to get a job at Chick-fil-A and wanted her mother to go in and get the applications from the local Chick-fil-A's because she was too stressed out about that.
Yeah. And it is stressful in the beginning. It's stressful right up until the time you do it and you navigate it and you have the summer and you go, "Oh, I handled that." And because I handled that, I can handle other stuff. But when we rescue our kids from those awkward moments because we can't stand how uncomfortable they are, we just get stuck. They're stuck and we're stuck.
Absolutely. And I say this having done some of this myself. Like I have two daughters, and one was able to do certain things more easily than the other. And then one has different, they have different challenges.
Yeah.
But the anxiety I would sometimes feel over things that were difficult for one of my kids and how much I would tend to step in thinking that she genuinely wouldn't be okay if I didn't. Now, I didn't get into like her conflicts with her friends, and there are parents who do that. And obviously, if your child's being bullied in a way that's dangerous, that's a whole different can of worms. But, parents contacting friends and calling
Ugh.
parents, right? I mean, my parents didn't know one thing about what went on with me and my friends. We figured it out. And, that really is a huge part of a child's social emotional development. So I think for some of this, circling back to what I was saying, is just that it is stressful. There is fear, especially if you see your kid suffering or sense your kid might suffer. But if you don't let them fail a little, I mean, I think that's what we're dancing around, but we're not saying. We've got to let kids fail. They didn't
Yeah.
bring in their assignment. maybe they get an F. And I'll hear women saying, yeah, but then they won't get into college. I mean, okay, but what's going to happen when they're 26 and they don't know how to deal with a real world consequence in their first job? You propped them up, paid for them to go to school, and were the puppet master, and
Yeah.
then they can't navigate a marriage or a job or an adult life.
Yeah, and I think and watching, I have so much to say on this because I have an experience of watching my daughter go to a private college, and so many of the I'm not going to speak for everybody. There's some incredible students at the school she goes to,
Yeah.
but there are a lot of people that hang out by the pool and and get by, right? And their
Yeah.
parents are paying to sort of like stamp a passport,
Yeah.
like a rite of passage in their metaphorical passport, right? And they're not really learning anything. And the parents don't really care. It's like you're doing, but they're not set up to succeed. So
Right.
I watched that whole thing go down and I'm like, huh. Like I don't know would I want to pay for her to go to a private school if she were like not a great investment? No. Like it wouldn't feel good to me. Like even just for the superficial status of it. And on that same line, that same child had a setback early in her life where she didn't get into a school she wanted to get into, and I did not rescue her from that scenario, and it ripped my gut out, but you know what? It was one of the best things that ever happened to her.
I
And so I
agree.
have such a new respect for things that don't go well. They're actually these amazing forks in the road that if you can navigate them properly, can be your biggest wins.
I could not agree more. And I think it took me a while to recognize that I was going to enable my children. If in some ways, I think my parents enabled me emotionally, like divorce guilt. And I think I had some of that toward my kids, but I made a change in letting them suffer consequences. And it was very uncomfortable for me, but it's the best thing I ever did. And, really, there is no way to succeed without it because we know all human beings don't learn from success. We learn from failure.
Oh, 100%. I'm
Yeah. And
such
that's
a
just,
champion of failure
yeah. And that's the
and
way it
pain.
is. That's the way it is. You learn 95% of what you learn from what goes wrong. So, and from suffering. So, if we're not letting kids fail at all, we're not letting them learn and they're
Yeah.
not going to be able to function. And some of the genuine, I mean, this is research documented, but the cost of this is that these generations now that helicopter parenting has become the norm are on more psychotropic medication. There are higher rates of suicidality. I'm not blaming all of this on parenting, but it's a part of the puzzle that parents are so overly involved. They don't have emotional regulation skills, they don't have social skills. It affects health later in life because one study showed because kids are not learning how to take care of themselves. So, they fly the coop and then they don't know what to do. Not to mention how many kids are living at home forever, even
Yeah.
after college.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing to navigate too, of like how much nest to provide, and how much runway to provide for a kid. I have different perspectives depending on the kid. But I think if they're gonna be
Yeah.
living with you through college, then it's like work becomes really important and like other areas of self-sufficiency become important and contributing and so you have to make it as if they're doing things in the bigger world. Like you can't be hot housing your kids in like their childhood bedroom for an infinite number of years.
You
It's
can't.
not cute.
Yeah. Listen, I moved into a small house once my kids went to college. I'm like, nobody is living here permanently.
Exactly.
Yeah, and
Exactly.
and listen, it's very true that you have to evaluate based on the child, but let's give some thought to what you need to do or how you can kind of break out of this and strike the right note of being a good, supportive, loving parent without over parenting. And I think that one of them is, not jumping in immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, and checking your own stuff out. Like, where
Yep.
is your own stuff showing up?
Yep.
Ooh, I'm not gonna feel good if my daughter doesn't do a sorority. I did a sorority, and, like, that's the only way that she's gonna feel connected, and I'm feeling really anxious about that. Like, where is your story getting overlapping their story? And, like, can you pull yourself back
And can
and
you start with being aware of it?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true because, I think where it will show up for me is I don't have any of that like ego investment of my children need to be a certain way so I feel good. I don't, that doesn't fit for me. But what does is wanting my kids to be okay, wanting to know they can support themselves. And when I see a pathway that I'm like, oh, this makes so much sense for you, and I mention it, and then there isn't the enthusiasm, and I know they don't know all that I know. The
yes.
temptation to like force feed that wisdom and be like, no, you have to do this. And let me tell you why. And right, learn from my mistakes. And you cannot shove that down someone's throat.
Yeah, that is a process that will unfold, when they're ready for it, not when we're ready for it. And I see this too, even
Yeah.
in the case of colleges, is when you have a bright kid, and I see some of these parents go nuts on like SAT prep, and you have to do this, and they talk about it as a we. We're
Yes.
going to Stanford. We're going to get into. It's like, oh wow, you are so in the journey
Yeah.
and to what end?
Right. And that's where I think what we're saying is ask yourself why. What is this really about? And if it's fear that your child won't be okay if they don't go to Stanford, get curious about that. Because
Yes.
not that it's not okay to have goals for your child, but that is just couldn't be further from the truth. And then B, what part of your own stuff is showing up in that?
Right. Yeah, and how much of it is, like, your social embarrassment if the 6 people you hang around are like, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear she didn't get into X." Is that what's driving you? Is, like, fear of other people's opinions and judgment, which is so real.
It is. I just don't relate to that at all. Now, neither of my kids wanted to go or could go to Stanford, nor
No,
nor
me
did I.
either.
Yeah.
I'm not on that path either. I'm
Uh,
not in that cohort either, but
no,
I've
no,
been intersected with it in on my journey,
me
and
too.
I see people who are caught in it, and it's restrictive,
Yeah,
and they're afraid. They're afraid of like, "Ugh, somehow I wasn't able to get my kid to
right.
go here."
And there's also a difference between feeling some of that, because I think ultimately we're all afraid for our kids and want them to be okay. That's
Yes.
what drives me. I just want my kids to have a good life. And I feel like I fucked up in certain ways. And, of course, I'm sure every parent does. And I want to make sure that I didn't fuck up completely and that, maybe I overdid certain things and could I do better now? And I just want them to be okay. But even if you're the parent who's like worried about where your kids are going to college because of social reasons or because of ego reasons, there's a difference between feeling that way and doing things to lawnmower or interfere
Right.
because everybody feels inner angst
Sure.
around your kids.
Sure.
But are you doing the college application,
Yes.
spending all of your money to like make sure they get in, even if it's like to a ludicrous degree, you know, really taking energy out of your own life and all of your energy is going into making your kids something you need them to be.
Yeah. And something I say in therapy all the time to parents, I say this all the time. It's like a catch line I say is give people their lives back. Be in the business of giving people their lives back. This is where
Yeah.
you're overly enmeshed with a partner or even a parent or your kid. Give everybody their life back because everybody is entitled to run their own life and they actually can do a better job of it than we can by
Yes.
like marionetting the whole situation. And the second thing that occurs to me is, and I love this, and I don't know if I said this in another podcast, but I think I love it so much, we might need to do a whole podcast about it. And it's when Dr. Becky said that the definition of entitlement is the fear of frustration. And I think that if we set our kids up to not be able to handle frustration, they
Yep,
end up
that's it.
being entitled. And so really think about that. I want to frustrate my kids so that
Yes.
they are going to get stronger and they're not going to be afraid of the world.
That's the thing, right? Is that they've got to develop frustration tolerance,
Yes.
distress
I'm
tolerance.
still working on it.
Yep,
Still working on it.
me too. But that's the resilience. That's how they get the grit. And that is part of life. So if you remove obstacles, make things easy, and shield them from failure, then they don't know how to deal with that. And they become not only incapable of functioning, but entitled and narcissistic.
And really what's under that is like they're so fragile.
Exactly.
And we don't want fragile kids. We want
No.
robust kids. So frustrate them now.
Yep. And I think that's another thing, right? Is telling your kids the truth. Maybe everything they do isn't perfect. Give them some honest feedback. Let them screw up.
Yep.
Let them have some failure and learn to feel bad and get to the other side of it. Let them work out some of their problems with friends. Obviously, if they're in danger, that's a whole nother thing. But every conflict with, I mean, girls being young, there are going to be some ugly moments.
Yeah. Yeah. And we talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the episode, but you said when your parents were raising you, it was a little bit of like benign neglect. But what is it? It's like rose gardens like thrive with like a little benign neglect.
Yes,
So
blooms
think
and
of,
thorns.
yeah. So it's like you step out, and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't
And I
have to
think
step all the way out.
right, because what we're advocating for is to be engaged and be supportive. You want your kids to come to you for support, but
Yes.
you want to teach them skills and engage their ability to think critically and try things so they can have experiential learning rather than fixing it for them or telling them, here's what you have to do.
Because that is all coming from your own anxiety.
Exactly.
That's what that is. So,
Right. And that's what I think what we see in therapy with clients is that they think, and I've fallen into this myself, my kid won't be okay. But it's really, you don't feel okay sitting through your anxiety while you wonder if your kid will be okay.
that's it.
So, takeaways from today: get curious about your motives, right? Take
Mhm.
a pause before you jump in and fix. Some things will require your intervention, but
But most things won't.
right, many things won't.
Yeah.
And the best thing you can do for your kids is to let them fail while they're younger and have some real world consequences so they can handle frustration and develop their own natural resilience and coping skills.
And if you need help in this, I mean, this is one of the things I've had moments in my parenting journey. I have a 21-year-old and my baby is 16 and I've an almost 18-year-old. I've had crucible moments in my parenting journey, as many of us have. And this is times I reach out for help
Yeah.
because I know I need it. So if you need a sounding board and you can't find perspective, because I think kids are one of these areas where it's so hard to get perspective, like this is a time to talk to somebody, maybe.
I agree. I'm glad you said that. That's a really good point. It is so hard. You're in the tunnel. It's the thing you care about the most. You
Totally.
don't have perspective.
Your fear is
Yeah.
high as it's ever going to be about anything, usually.
Yeah. And the idea, it's easy to say, let your kids fail, but when you're in the decision, it feels hellacious and sometimes it doesn't feel like a choice. But I think being more aware of it and working on it is the best that we can do, just trying to navigate each decision where we're not letting fear or our ego take over and we're really thinking about what's best for our children in the long run. Didn't you have a couple books that maybe you thought were good on parenting?
Some of the better ones, I mean, I love the stuff with Dr. Becky.
Yeah, she's great.
Dr. Becky Kennedy, Good Inside. I think her stuff is just, it comes from really good place. I like her long form podcast she does. If you're not going to pick up one of her books, I love The Conscious Parent by Shefali Sabari. That's a beautiful book. I love Dr. Daniel Amen's book about kids. He's a big proponent for like giving your kid their life back and stepping out. So if you need education or just some normalization, pick up some of those.
And let us know what you think.
Yeah.
If you have questions, you can reach us through insightsfromthecouch.org. And we'd love to hear your feedback and your questions and can certainly address topics you're interested in future episodes as well.
Yeah, we want to know where you struggle.
And what would be helpful for us to talk about. All right. Well, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.
Take care.